When we look at why a narcissist becomes mad and shocked when everything they plotted has backfired, we have to begin with a simple psychological truth. They genuinely believed they were in control. Narcissistic dynamics are built on prediction. Over time, they study your reactions. They observe what triggers you, what softens you, what makes you chase, what makes you defend yourself. They create an internal psychological map of you. And once they believe they understand that map, they operate with confidence. They assume they can provoke, withdraw, triangulate, smear, or discard, and you will respond in a familiar way. Their sense of power comes not just from manipulation itself, but from the certainty that it will work. So, when it doesn't, something destabilizing happens. The shock you see is not moral awakening. It is structural collapse. Their internal model of reality fails. The script they wrote in their mind, where you beg, react, crumble, or return, does not unfold the way they anticipated. And for a personality organized around control, unpredictability feels like threat. You have to understand, narcissistic control is rarely loud in the beginning. It is subtle. It is relational. It is built through repetition. If every time they withdraw affection you pursue, that pattern becomes encoded. If every time they criticize you defend yourself emotionally, that becomes part of the script. Over months or years, they begin to believe they can engineer emotional outcomes. But growth changes the equation. When you heal, regulate your nervous system, set boundaries, or simply choose silence, you disrupt the system they relied on. You are no longer the predictable source of emotional supply. You are no longer reacting in ways that confirm their dominance. And this is where the anger comes from. It is not just frustration, it is ego injury. It is the painful realization that their control was conditional, dependent on your participation. When you withdraw that participation, the illusion of power weakens. There is also something deeper happening psychologically. Narcissists often equate control with safety. In early development, unpredictability may have felt dangerous. Control became a way to manage anxiety. So, when their strategies fail, they are not just losing influence over you. They are losing an internal coping mechanism. That loss can trigger panic, rage, or intensified manipulation attempts. They may double down. They may escalate. They may attempt new strategies. Guilt, charm, threats, smearing. Anything to restore the old dynamic. But what truly unsettles them is this. You evolved beyond the version of yourself they calculated. They underestimated your capacity for growth because they believed your identity was static. They believed your attachment to them was permanent leverage. They assumed that your emotional responses were fixed traits, not adaptive patterns you could unlearn. When you step outside the script, their prediction model collapses. And without prediction, they feel exposed. There is something almost philosophical here. Power that depends on another person's weakness is never stable. It is borrowed power. The moment the other person strengthens, the system destabilizes. That is why they are shocked, ties, and not because karma struck them, not because fate intervened, but because the equation changed. You changed, and when someone's entire strategy was built on the assumption that you would never outgrow them, your evolution becomes their greatest miscalculation. The real backfire is not dramatic revenge. It is simple transformation. And nothing unsettles a manipulator more than realizing the person they thought they controlled has become uncontrollable. If we continue this line of thinking, we begin to see something even more revealing. Most narcissistic strategies are not built around who you are. Now, they are built around who you used to be. When a narcissist plots, calculates, or manipulates, they are drawing from historical data. They rely on patterns. They remember the version of you that tolerated inconsistency, the version that over-explained, the version that reacted emotionally, that chased closure, that tried to fix what they broke. Their entire psychological strategy is constructed around your former responses. And here is the critical point. They assume continuity. They assume you are static. Narcissistic personalities often struggle to perceive others as evolving individuals. In their internal world, people become roles. The forgiving one, the emotional one, the jealous one, the strong one who always comes back. Once you are categorized, you are mentally frozen in that position, and every future action they take is calculated based on that fixed image. So when you change, truly change, it disrupts more than a plan. It disrupts their cognitive framework. Perhaps you went to therapy. Perhaps you educated yourself about trauma bonds. Perhaps you strengthened your boundaries quietly, without announcement. Perhaps you simply became tired of repeating the same cycle. To whatever the catalyst, something shifted internally. You no longer respond from wounded reflex. You respond from awareness. But they don't see that shift immediately. They initiate the same strategy: withdrawal to provoke pursuit, provocation to trigger reaction, triangulation to create insecurity, a smear campaign to bait defense. They expect a familiar emotional choreography, and when it doesn't happen, confusion sets in. Because in their mind, the old script should still work. This is where the shock becomes visible. It is the moment they realize the person they thought they understood is no longer predictable. Their manipulation was calibrated to your old wounds, but you are no longer operating from those wounds. And psychologically, that is destabilizing. There is something important to understand here about identity. When you are trauma bonded or emotionally entangled, your nervous system is reactive. It seeks relief from anxiety. It seeks release from anxiety. It seeks validation. A narcissist learns how to activate and soothe that system strategically. That is how control is maintained. But when you regulate your nervous system independently, when you no longer require them for emotional closure, the dynamic collapses. They miscalculated because they assumed your growth would stall. Often, narcissists project their own resistance to change onto others. Since they struggle with deep internal transformation, they unconsciously assume you will remain the same, that you will stay attached, that you will remain available for manipulation. Your growth exposes their stagnation. And this is where anger begins to mix with shock. Because your evolution is not just inconvenient, it is humiliating. It reveals that their influence had limits. It proves that the version of you they relied on was temporary, not permanent. From a philosophical perspective, this speaks to a larger truth. Any strategy built on someone's weakness will eventually fail if that person chooses strength. Control is sustainable only when the controlled remains unaware. With moment awareness enters the system, the dynamic shifts. So when everything they plotted backfires, it is not because their tactics suddenly stopped working universally. It is because they stopped working on you. And that is, that they did not anticipate that you would outgrow the identity they assigned you. The greatest disruption to manipulation is not revenge. It is evolution. And nothing unsettles someone more than realizing the person they tried to control has become someone they can no longer predict. If we move deeper into this dynamic, we come to something that seems simple on the surface, but is profoundly destabilizing to a narcissist. Silence. Not the silent treatment they use as punishment. Not passive aggression. I'm speaking about regulated, intentional, grounded silence. The kind that comes from detachment, not resentment. The kind that says, without words, I am no longer participating. For a narcissistic personality, silence is not neutral. It is threatening. Their entire relational strategy depends on emotional movement. They provoke to create reaction. They withdraw to create pursuit. They smear to create defense, triangulate to create jealousy. It doesn't matter whether the emotion they trigger is love, anger, fear, or confusion. What matters is that they can still move you. Emotional movement equals influence. When you respond, even negatively, you confirm that they still occupy psychological space inside you, and that confirmation stabilizes their ego. It reassures them that their presence still has impact. But when you respond with silence, not coldness, not suppressed rage, but true emotional neutrality, the system malfunctions. Because silence offers no data. It does not feed their need for validation. It does not allow them to measure their influence. It does not confirm that you are hurt, jealous, or longing. It creates ambiguity. And ambiguity for someone who depends on control feels intolerable. There is something neurologically significant here. Narcissistic patterns often rely on predictable feedback loops. Action, reaction, stimulus, 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 response. When that loop breaks, the nervous system experiences uncertainty, and uncertainty can trigger anxiety, even panic. This is why silence often escalates their behavior initially. They may attempt stronger provocations, louder smears, more dramatic gestures. They are not necessarily trying to reconcile. They are trying to restore the feedback loop. They want proof that they can still reach you. But silence, grounded silence, communicates something powerful without speaking. Your tactics no longer work here. And this is what shocks them, because in their internal narrative, you were supposed to react. You were supposed to defend yourself against lies. You were supposed to demand explanations. You were supposed to chase clarity. Silence disrupts the role they assigned you. It also removes the drama. Narcissistic dynamics often thrive on intensity. High emotional swings create attachment bonds. Conflict, followed by reconciliation, strengthens trauma cycles. When you remove participation, the intensity dissolves. Without your energy, the drama cannot sustain itself. Philosophically, silence represents sovereignty. It is the refusal to be emotionally conscripted into someone else's psychological warfare. It is not avoidance. It is discernment. End plays. It is discernment. That is, recognizing that engagement would only reinforce the very system you are trying to exit. And here's the paradox. Silence feels small, but its impact is enormous. Because when you do not react, they are left alone with their own behavior. Without your emotional deflection, the consequences begin to reflect back at them. The shock is not just about losing you. It is about losing access to your nervous system. You are no longer emotionally available for manipulation. That realization can feel like rejection to them. It can feel like loss of power. They can even feel like betrayal of the script they believed. Time was permanent. But in reality, it is simply the restoration of your autonomy. Silence is not weakness. It is strategic disengagement. It is the quiet collapse of a dynamic that required your emotional labor to survive. And nothing unsettles a manipulator more than discovering their influence has met a boundary they cannot penetrate. Because when your silence is rooted in self-possession, it speaks louder than any reaction ever could. If we look at what happens next when their plans begin to fail, we often see another familiar tactic: projection. And this is where things become psychologically fascinating. Projection is not random. It is defensive. It is the act of disowning parts of oneself and placing them onto someone else. If they are deceptive, you become the liar. If they are unstable, you become crazy. If they are manipulative, suddenly you are the controlling one. This maneuver serves two purposes. It protects their self-image, and it recruits you into defending yourself. Then that recruitment is essential because the moment you start arguing against a false accusation, you are back inside the dynamic. You are explaining. You are proving. You are emotionally invested in correcting the narrative. From their perspective, the system is restored. You are reacting again. But when everything they plotted backfires, projection begins to collapse. And it collapses in a very specific way. It collapses when you refuse the role. You see, narcissistic dynamics depend on casting. There is always a villain and a victim, always a hero and a betrayer. These roles are not accidental. They stabilize the narcissist's internal world. If they can assign you the position of the unstable one, then they remain rational. If you are the jealous one, then they remain desirable. If you are the bitter X, then they remain the misunderstood survivor. The story protects T ego. But when you stop participating in the story, when you do not defend, do not counterattack, do not attempt to clear your name, something unusual happens. The projection has nowhere to land. Psychologically, projection requires absorption. It requires someone to internalize or fight against the false label. When you remain steady and detached, the accusation hangs in the air unsupported. Over time, observers begin to notice inconsistencies. Patterns become visible. The energy behind the smear feels excessive. And this is deeply unsettling for them. Because projection works best in chaos. It thrives on confusion and emotional reactivity. When you respond calmly, or not at all, the contrast becomes stark. Their intensity begins to look disproportionate. Their narrative begins to look forced. What shocks them is not that you defended yourself well. It's that you didn't need to. You trusted that truth does not require performance. There is something profoundly destabilizing about that. When you refuse the assigned role, you quietly reject the entire psychological structure they built around you. You are no longer the character in their play. You are an independent actor who stepped off the stage, and without you in the role, the script collapses. Philosophically, this is about identity sovereignty. It is the refusal to let someone else define your character in order to protect their ego. It is understanding that not every accusation requires rebuttal. Sometimes the most powerful response is coherence, living consistently enough that lies dissolve over time. Projection is an attempt to export shame. When you do not accept a shipment, the shame remains with its originator, and that is the true backfire. Because once the projection fails, they are left facing the very traits they tried to disown. The anger intensifies not because you attacked them, but because you did not cooperate. Refusing the role is not passive. It is strategic emotional maturity. When you stop arguing with distortion and simply remain aligned with reality, manipulation loses oxygen. Nothing frustrates a narcissist more than discovering that the narrative they crafted cannot survive without your participation. When their direct manipulation fails and their projections no longer land, many narcissists turn to something more indirect. The smear campaign. This is where they attempt to regain control not by influencing you, but by influencing how others see you. On the surface, it can look strategic, even calculated. They begin to tell selective stories. They frame themselves as misunderstood. They highlight your worst moments, often moments they provoked, and remove the context. The goal is not truth. The goal is narrative dominance. Because as they cannot control you anymore, they will attempt to control perception. There is something deeply revealing in this move. A smear campaign is not about justice. It is about restoring ego equilibrium. When everything they plotted backfires, when you don't react, don't chase, don't defend, they experience a loss of psychological leverage. So they seek a new arena where they can feel powerful again. Public opinion. But here is where the backfire becomes subtle and profound. Smear campaigns depend on urgency and emotional charge. They rely on your immediate reaction. They expect you to rush in and correct every lie, to defend your character passionately, to try to win allies. That reaction would create more drama, more noise, and in that noise, their narrative can survive. When you refuse to engage, something different happens. Your consistency begins to speak. Over time, people observe patterns. They notice contradictions. They see that you are not behaving in alignment with the accusatee. And they also observe something else. The intensity of the smear often reveals more about the one spreading it than about the target. Emotionally regulated people do not need to destroy others to validate themselves. What shocks the narcissist is not that you fought back harder. It's that you trusted time. You trusted your character. You trusted that integrity compounds quietly. And this is deeply destabilizing because smear campaigns are fueled by insecurity. They are attempts to outsource shame. Painting you as flawed, unstable, or malicious, they attempt to distance themselves from their own behavior. But when the campaign fails to generate the desired collapse, when you remain grounded and your life continues forward, their credibility begins to erode. There is something almost mathematical about it. If one person consistently accuses and dramatizes, while the other remains composed and steady, observers eventually question the imbalance. People may not confront them directly, but doubt enters the system, and doubt is enough to weaken narrative control. From a psychological standpoint, this is the natural consequence of manipulation. When someone repeatedly distorts reality, their trust capital depletes. You do not need to attack them. Their own pattern becomes visible. The irony is that smear campaigns often accelerate the very exposure they are meant to prevent. In attempting to control perception, they overextend. They exaggerate. They reveal resentment, and resentment is difficult to disguise long-term. Meanwhile, your restraint becomes strength. This does not mean it is painless. Being misrepresented can be deeply wounding. But when you resist the urge to descend into chaos, you step outside the battlefield entirely, and that is the true backfire. Because manipulation thrives in reaction, but it withers in dignity. In the end, reputation built on distortion is fragile. Character built on consistency is resilient. And when you allow truth to unfold without forcing it, the noise fades, but integrity remains. There is another layer to this shock that often goes unspoken. Many narcissists do not just expect you to react, they expect you to break. When they discard, withdraw, triangulate, or attempt to destabilize you, there is often an unspoken assumption underneath it all that you will crumble without them, that you will spiral, that you will feel lost, diminished, incapable. In their internal narrative, your strength was exaggerated, your independence performative, your resilience conditional upon their presence. So when everything they plotted backfires, one of the most destabilizing outcomes is this. You don't collapse, you level up. You become calmer, more focused, more disciplined. You invest in yourself, you reconnect with friends, you pursue therapy, you start taking your health seriously. Do you rebuild your life in ways that are visible, not loudly, not to provoke them, but steadily? And this is where the real ego injury occurs, because their strategy was rooted in a hierarchy. In their mind, they were the prize. They were the emotional center. They believed that removing themselves would create a vacuum in your life, that absence would equal devastation. But instead, absence becomes space, and in that space, you grow. Psychologically, this disrupts something fundamental. Narcissistic personalities often regulate their self-worth through comparison. If they can believe you are struggling without them, their superiority remains intact. If they can imagine you longing, regretting, deteriorating, then their narrative holds. But when evidence contradicts that, when you appear stronger, more grounded, more self-possessed, the hierarchy collapses. It forces a confrontation with an horrible possibility. Perhaps they were not the source of your stability. Perhaps they were the source of your chaos. That reversal is difficult to process. Instead of gratitude for your growth, they may experience resentment. Instead of admiration, they may attempt to diminish your progress. They may say you've changed, as if growth is betrayal. They may try to minimize your achievements, or reinsert themselves just to test whether the old dynamic can be restored, because your elevation represents loss of control. There is also something deeper happening beneath the ego. When you level up after being discarded, it challenges their internal defense that they are indispensable. Narcissistic structures often mask profound fears of inadequacy. If you thrive without them, it threatens the belief that they are uniquely necessary, and so the shock becomes layered. Surprise at your resilience, anger at their miscalculation, and anxiety about their own replaceability. From a philosophical standpoint, this is the quiet power of self-development. You did not fight their plot directly. You simply refused to collapse under it. You redirected your energy inward instead of outward. And that is what makes it so disruptive. Because they were prepared for conflict. They were prepared for drama. They were prepared for tears and pleas and emotional volatility. They were not prepared for discipline. They were not prepared for you to transmute pain into growth. When someone expects you to shrink and instead you expand, it forces them to confront their own stagnation. And that confrontation can feel unbearable. The greatest backfire is not revenge. It is resilience. When the person they tried to destabilize becomes stronger, wiser, and less accessible, their strategy is exposed as flawed from the beginning. And nothing unsettles a manipulator more than realizing their attempt to break you became the catalyst that built you. If we go even deeper, we begin to see that what truly destabilizes the narcissist, when everything backfires, is not just losing you, it is losing supply. This is a concept that must be understood clearly. Supply is not love. It is not partnership. It is not intimacy. Supply is emotional fuel. It is attention, admiration, reaction, validation, even conflict. Anything that confirms their psychological significance. For someone organized around fragile self-worth, supply regulates the nervous system. It soothes internal insecurity. It reinforces the false self. When you praise them, chase them, defend yourself against their accusations, or even argue passionately, you are feeding the system. You are confirming that they matter deeply in your emotional world. When you withdraw that energy, something destabilizing happens internally. At first, they may tell themselves it does not matter, that they have options, that there are other sources of validation, and sometimes there are. But what they are actually losing is not just a person. They are losing a predictable source of emotional regulation. You were familiar supply. You responded in known ways. You reacted on cue. You engaged in cycles they understood. Your nervous system was entangled with theirs. That entanglement created stability for them, even if it created chaos for you. When that entanglement breaks, they feel it. And this is where the shock intensifies, because it exposes dependency, not yours, but theirs. Narcissistic personalities often project neediness onto others. They accuse you of being too attached, too emotional, too reliant. But beneath that projection is a deeper truth. They are dependent on external validation to maintain their internal equilibrium. The supply stops, they are left alone with themselves. And that can feel terrifying. Without admiration, they must face insecurity. Without reaction, they must sit with silence. Without control, they must confront unpredictability. These internal states are often what the narcissistic structure was designed to avoid in the first place. This is why you may see escalation when supply is cut off, hoovering attempts, sudden apologies, provocations, public displays meant to incite jealousy. Provocations, public displays meant to incite jealousy. They are not always attempts at reconciliation. They are attempts to restore regulation. They want to know, can I still access you, a liver? They want to know, can I still access you, ideal? But when everything they plotted backfires, and you remain emotionally unavailable to the old dynamic, the system destabilizes further. The ego experiences injury, not because you left, but because you are no longer responsive. There is something profoundly humbling in that realization for them, because it reveals that their power was conditional. Because it reveals that their power was conditional, dependent on your participation. It depended on your nervous system being hooked into theirs. When you unhook, the illusion dissolves. Philosophically, this speaks to autonomy. Emotional independence is not coldness. It is sovereignty. It is the ability to regulate yourself without requiring validation from someone who once destabilized you. When you reach that point, you are no longer supply. You are self-contained. And that is deeply unsettling to someone who once derived stability from your reactions. The backfire, then, is not dramatic revenge. It is the quiet removal of access. It is the realization that the emotional pipeline has closed. They are mad and shocked, not simply because they lost you, but because they lost control over how you feel about them. And when someone can no longer extract emotional fuel from you, they must either evolve or confront the emptiness they have been avoiding all along. When we reach the final layer of this dynamic, we have to move away from mystical language and towards psychological reality. People often call it karma when everything a narcissist plotted backfires, but what we are really witnessing is consequence, not cosmic punishment, not fate intervening, consequence. Tupulation erodes trust. Repeated deception fractures credibility. Control tactics weaken connection. Smear campaigns damage reputation over time, especially when inconsistencies accumulate. Emotional exploitation exhausts people. These are not spiritual laws. They are psychological and relational laws. And what shocks the narcissist is not that the universe targeted them. It is that the system they relied on was unsustainable. Titillation can appear effective. You can provoke someone and get a reaction. You can provoke someone and get a reaction. You can triangulate and create jealousy. You can distort facts and temporarily shift perception. You can discard and expect someone to chase. In the short term, these tactics work because they exploit emotional vulnerability. But long-term relational stability requires trust, coherence, and integrity. Without those, every connection becomes fragile. Every alliance becomes conditional. Every reputation becomes precarious. When everything backfires, what is happening is not mystical justice. It is the natural collapse of unstable architecture. You cannot consistently distort reality without eventually being seen as unreliable. You cannot repeatedly betray trust without people withdrawing. You cannot weaponize relationships without creating isolation. Over time, patterns reveal themselves. The narcissist is often shocked because they believe they were the exception to consequence. Their charm, intelligence, or strategic thinking convinced them they could outmaneuver the system indefinitely. They mistook short-term wins for long-term power. But psychological systems are cumulative. Every action deposits something into the relational bank account, either trust or doubt, respect or suspicion. When their plots unravel, it is often because the account was already overdrawn. And this is where the shock turns into anger. Because consequences feel unfair when you are accustomed to avoiding them. It feels like betrayal when people stop believing you. It feels like injustice when former allies distance themselves. But in reality, what is unfolding is alignment. Behavior and outcome are reconnecting. There is also something existential happening here. Narcissistic defenses often create the illusion of invulnerability. I can always find new supply. I can always control perception. I can always outthink the situation. When backfire occurs, it punctures that illusion. It forces that illusion. It forces confrontation with limitation. And limitation is deeply uncomfortable for someone whose identity is built on superiority. From a philosophical standpoint, this is the moment where growth becomes possible, but only if humility enters the picture. Consequence is not cruelty. It is feedback. It is reality, correcting distortion. The tragedy is that some will double down instead of reflecting. They will blame, escalate, rewrite narratives again, but others, in rare cases, may begin to recognize the pattern. Because when everything you plotted fails, it is no longer coincidence, it is pattern exposure. And pattern exposure is an invitation. The deeper truth is simple. Manipulation can win battles, but integrity sustains life. Control can create temporary dominance, but it cannot manufacture genuine respect. When the structure collapses, it is not because the world conspired against them. It is because reality eventually outweighs illusion. And in the end, nothing backfires more powerfully than a strategy built on deception, because sooner or later, the truth demands balance.